The alert hit my monitor at 4:47 on a Tuesday afternoon, the kind of quiet hour when most of the trading floor had already mentally checked out and started planning dinner reservations. $19,140,000, moving from a private wealth account belonging to one of our top-tier VIP clients into a shell company registered in Delaware that had existed for exactly 11 weeks. My name is Grayson Whitaker. I'm 52 years old, and I've spent the last 26 years of my life reading the fine print that other people either can't understand or don't want to. What happened over the next 11 days would remind an entire executive floor that federal reporting isn't a suggestion, and that the person you belittle in meetings might be the only one standing between your bank and a raid. I stared at the screen for a full minute before I moved. 26 years of anti-money laundering work teaches you to slow down when your gut is speaking loudly, because the difference between a legitimate transfer and a felony is usually buried 3 layers deep in ownership documentation. I pulled up the beneficiary entity, an LLC named Meridian Holdings Group, and started tracing the registered agent. The address was a mail forwarding service in Wilmington. The listed manager was a name I didn't recognize, but the pattern of the transfer, the timing, the amount just below the threshold that would trigger automatic scrutiny at the correspondent bank, all of it lit up every warning bell I'd been trained to hear. I opened a new case file at 4:53 and started building the suspicious activity report. Before I go any further, let me tell you who I was in that building and why the phone call I received at 6:22 that same evening was the most catastrophic professional decision my director would ever make. I joined Cascadia Private Bank in 1999 after 7 years at the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, where I'd been trained by people who chased Colombian cartel money through shell company networks for a living. Vindication taught me that dirty money never announces itself. It moves quietly, patiently, disguised as ordinary business, and it takes someone who has spent decades studying its habits to recognize what's actually happening on a wire confirmation. Cascadia hired me because they wanted a serious BSA officer, someone who could keep the bank out of the newspapers and off the wrong side of a consent order. For 26 years, I did exactly that. I filed thousands of suspicious activity reports, coordinated with federal investigators on more cases than I could count, and helped Cascadia navigate 2 full FDIC examinations without a single material finding. I knew every client on the VIP list not by their net worth, but by the shape of their transactions, the way legitimate wealthy people move money versus the way people trying to hide something do. You can't fake that kind of pattern recognition. You develop it slowly, watching thousands of accounts over decades, learning which questions to ask and which answers should make your stomach tighten. That expertise made me indispensable to the compliance department. That same expertise made Ronan Blackwell, our new director of private wealth, believe I was an obstacle to his growth targets. Ronan had been recruited from a competitor 18 months earlier with a mandate to expand our high net worth portfolio and a compensation package tied directly to new asset inflows. In his world, my job was to say yes to onboarding and no to filing paperwork that might scare a client away. In my world, my job was to protect a federally chartered institution from becoming an instrument of financial crime. We had been on a collision course from his first week. The VIP client whose account triggered the alert was Alastair Cheng Vanderberg, a real estate developer whose family office had been with Cascadia for 9 years. His portfolio sat just north of $240 million, and he was exactly the kind of client Ronan built his quarterly bonus targets around. I'd reviewed Alastair's account activity dozens of times over the years and never once found anything worth escalating. His transfers were predictable, his tax filings were clean, and his business dealings, at least the ones visible on the surface, made sense for someone in his industry. That was what made this particular transfer so unusual. Nothing about Meridian Holdings Group fit the pattern I'd come to expect from him. I spent the next hour building out the case. I pulled the incorporation documents from Meridian, cross-referenced the registered agent against 3 other entities I'd flagged over the past year, and ran the manager's name through our enhanced due diligence database. What came back made my hands go cold. The manager listed on Meridian's paperwork had, until 14 months earlier, been an executive assistant at a construction firm, currently under federal investigation for laundering money through fraudulent invoicing schemes. She had no public financial background, no history of managing entities, and her only visible income before Meridian was a modest salary that would never have supported the formation of a company handling $19 million wire transfers. Somebody had put her name on that paperwork as a nominee. That's not a legal opinion. That's 26 years of experience recognizing what a nominee arrangement looks like. At 5:41 that evening, I finalized my draft of the suspicious activity report. I attached the wire confirmation, the entity documentation, the enhanced due diligence findings, and my written analysis of why this transaction met the criteria for federal reporting under the Bank Secrecy Act. I saved the file to our secure compliance server, where it would be locked into an audit trail the moment I hit submit. Then I did something I'd done thousands of times over my career. I picked up the phone and called Ronan Blackwell to give him the professional courtesy of a heads-up before I filed. That courtesy, extended to a man who did not deserve it, is what started the fire that would eventually burn his career to the ground. Ronan picked up on the third ring. I could hear the noise of a restaurant in the background, glasses clinking, someone laughing at another table. "Grayson, make it quick, I'm with a client." I told him what I'd found. I explained the Meridian structure, the nominee manager, the timing pattern, and my intention to file a SAR within the next 30 minutes. I told him I was giving him the heads up as a matter of professional courtesy, not because I was seeking approval. Federal reporting doesn't require executive sign-off, and any BSA officer worth their license knows that trying to get one would itself be a compliance violation. The silence on the other end of the phone lasted about 8 seconds. When he spoke again, his voice had changed completely. "Grayson, don't file anything yet. I need you in my office at 6:15. Do not submit that report before we talk. That's a direct instruction." I told him I'd see him at 6:15 and I hung up. Then I did what any BSA officer with a functioning survival instinct would do in that situation. I opened the file, reviewed my analysis one final time, and submitted the suspicious activity report to FinCEN at 5:58 p.m. The confirmation number arrived in my inbox at 5:59. Federal reports once filed cannot be recalled. Ronan didn't know that yet. I walked into Ronan's office at exactly 6:15, carrying a leather folio containing printed copies of everything I'd filed. He was standing behind his desk, tie loosened, jacket thrown over the back of his chair like he'd rushed straight from the restaurant. A woman I didn't recognize was sitting in one of the guest chairs, tapping something into her phone. She looked up when I entered, offered a thin professional smile, and set the phone face down on her lap. Ronan gestured toward the empty chair across from her without saying hello. "Grayson, this is Delphine Ashworth from HR. I've asked her to sit in on this conversation." I nodded to Delphine, took my seat, and set the folio on my lap. In 26 years of compliance work, I'd been called into exactly 2 meetings with HR present. Both of them had ended with someone being terminated. I already knew where this conversation was heading, and I already knew what I was going to say when we got there. The only question was how long Ronan would take to arrive at his mistake. "I want to understand what you were thinking with the Cheng Vanderberg situation," Ronan began. "You called me 30 minutes ago about a transfer that, as far as I can tell, is a legitimate business transaction between a longtime client and a properly registered legal entity. You've been in this industry long enough to know that private wealth clients structure their affairs through LLCs all the time. So help me understand why you decided to escalate this to the point of a federal filing without proper internal review." I took a moment before answering, not because I needed to think about my response, but because I wanted Ronan to feel the weight of the silence. "Ronan, the The Bank Secrecy Act doesn't require internal review before a SAR is filed. In fact, seeking executive approval for a filing decision would itself constitute a violation of the safe harbor provisions that protect the bank from liability. The BSA officer has independent statutory authority to make filing determinations. That's not company policy. That's federal law. Delphine wrote something on the pad in front of her. Ronan's jaw tightened. I'm not questioning your authority, Grayson. I'm questioning your judgment. This transfer has explanations. Alastair has been restructuring his holdings for the past 6 months, and Meridian is part of a broader portfolio reorganization his tax counsel has been advising him on. If you had come to me first, I could have provided you with context that would have made a filing unnecessary. That was the moment I understood exactly what was happening. Ronan hadn't called me into his office to discuss compliance procedure. He had called me in to establish a paper trail suggesting that I'd acted rashly, so that when the SAR eventually came to light, he could claim he'd tried to intervene before I made what he was already framing as a mistake. Delphine wasn't there to witness a coaching conversation. She was there to document my termination. Ronan, I appreciate that context, but context doesn't change the reporting obligation. When a transaction meets the criteria for suspicious activity under the BSA, filing isn't optional and it isn't subject to executive override. The report has been submitted. It went to FinCEN at 5:58 this evening. His face didn't change, but something behind his eyes did. A flicker of calculation, followed by something colder. You filed it already. I filed it already, without waiting for our conversation. The conversation you requested began 17 minutes after I informed you of my intent to file. Federal reporting timelines don't accommodate dinner reservations. Delphine looked up from her notepad. Ronan sat down slowly, folded his hands on the desk in front of him, and stared at me for what felt like a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was carefully controlled, the way people sound when they've decided to say something they've been rehearsing. Grayson, I've been thinking a lot over the past few weeks about the direction of the compliance function here at Cascadia. The regulatory environment is evolving, our client base is evolving, and I'm not sure our current approach to BSA oversight is aligned with where the institution needs to go. This incident tonight has crystallized some concerns I've had for a while. He paused, glanced at Delphine, and continued. Effective immediately, we're going to be restructuring the compliance department. Your position is being eliminated as part of that restructuring. Delphine will walk you through the separation terms. I let the words settle in the room for a moment before I responded. There's a specific kind of quiet that happens when a person in authority believes they've just delivered a decisive blow, and the person receiving it doesn't react the way expected. Ronan was waiting for something. Anger, protest, pleading, negotiation. He got none of it. I opened my folio, took out a single sheet of paper and set it on his desk. It was a printed copy of the SAR confirmation from FinCEN, timestamped 5:59 p.m. Ronan, I want to make sure you understand what you're doing before Delphine starts her paperwork. You are terminating a BSA officer within 1 hour of that officer filing a suspicious activity report against a VIP client of this bank. If you'd like a moment to consult with legal counsel before we go any further, I'd strongly recommend taking it. Delphine's pen stopped moving. Ronan's eyes went to the sheet of paper, then back to me. Is that a threat? It's professional courtesy, the same courtesy I extended to you an hour ago. Anti-retaliation protections for BSA officers are among the strongest whistleblower provisions in federal financial regulation. Terminating a compliance officer in temporal proximity to a filing they made creates a presumption of retaliation that is extraordinarily difficult to overcome in litigation. Not to mention the attention it will attract from the same federal investigators who will be reading the SAR I just filed. Delphine cleared her throat. Ronan, perhaps we should. Delphine, I've got this. He hadn't taken his eyes off me. Grayson, this decision isn't retaliation. This decision is about restructuring, and it was made before this evening's events. I have documentation supporting that timeline. I nodded slowly. I'm sure you do. I'm sure that documentation was created recently, possibly this afternoon, possibly during the drive from the restaurant. Federal investigators are very good at analyzing metadata on internal documents to determine when they were actually authored. I'd encourage you to have your team be thorough. He stood up. I think we're done here. Delphine will handle the separation logistics. You'll be escorted from the building tonight. Your access badges and credentials will be deactivated immediately. I stood up as well. I picked up my folio, tucked it under my arm, and looked at him one final time. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't make a scene. I said only what I needed him to hear, the sentence I had been preparing since the moment I walked into that office. Ronan, the SAR is already filed. I turned and walked out. I didn't look back. I heard Delphine say something behind me, but I didn't slow down. My badge deactivated somewhere between the elevator and the ground floor. Security was waiting for me in the lobby. The security officer waiting for me in the lobby was a man named Terrell, whom I'd known for the better part of a decade. He'd been on the desk when I came in for late-night compliance meetings, when I'd worked through weekends on regulatory examinations, when I'd stayed past midnight during the acquisition due diligence 3 years earlier. He looked deeply uncomfortable holding the manila envelope that contained whatever paperwork Delphine had rushed downstairs. "Mr. Whitaker, I'm sorry about this." "Terrell, you're doing your job. Don't apologize for it." He handed me the envelope, walked me to the front doors, and unlocked them from the inside. I stepped out onto the sidewalk at 6:52 p.m. into a cold evening that felt strangely peaceful. I walked 3 blocks to the parking garage where I kept my car, sat in the driver's seat for a moment, and made 2 phone calls. The first was to my wife, Elena, to tell her what had happened. She listened without interrupting, asked one clarifying question about whether I'd filed the SAR before or after the meeting, and when I told her before, she said only, "Good. Come home. We'll figure out the rest tomorrow." 28 years of marriage teaches you which questions matter and which ones can wait. The second call was to Marcus Reyes, a former FinCEN colleague who now practiced whistleblower and financial regulation law in Washington. I left him a voicemail summarizing the last 3 hours and asked him to call me back in the morning. Then I drove home. I want to explain something about what happens after a moment like that, because if you've never been through it, you probably imagine that the person walking out feels devastated or vindicated or furious. I felt none of those things. What I felt mostly was clarity. 26 years of compliance work had prepared me for exactly this kind of night. Every decision I'd made in that office had been made with the assumption that it might one day be reviewed by federal investigators, deposed by opposing counsel, or scrutinized by an inspector general. When you operate that way for a quarter century, being tested by a moment like the one Ronan had just handed me doesn't feel like a crisis. It feels like a final exam you've been quietly preparing for since your first day on the job. Marcus called me back at 7:15 the following morning. I gave him the full account, walked him through every detail, and read him verbatim what Ronan had said in the meeting. Marcus was quiet for a long moment when I finished. Then he said, "Grayson, I need you to do 3 things today. First, do not communicate with anyone at Cascadia. Not Ronan, not HR, not colleagues, not friends who still work there. Every message becomes evidence, and right now you want a clean record. Second, preserve every document you legitimately have in your personal possession. Employment agreements, performance reviews, prior emails you sent to your personal address for reference. Do not access Cascadia systems in any way. Third, expect that within the next 2 weeks, federal agents will be in touch with you. When they call, do not speak with them until I'm on the line." I asked him what he thought was going to happen. Marcus laughed, but not in a way that suggested anything was funny. "Grayson, you filed a SAR on a $19 million transfer routed through a nominee LLC. You got fired within an hour by a director who had dinner plans that involved that same client's counsel. I don't know what the FBI is going to find when they start pulling threads on Meridian Holdings Group, but I promise you they're going to start pulling. And when they do, everyone in that building is going to wish they'd handled last night differently." The next several days passed in a strange kind of suspended animation. I took long walks in the mornings, worked on the fence project I'd been putting off in the backyard, and spent evenings reading through the file boxes I'd accumulated over the years of professional development materials. Alina went to work, came home, cooked dinner, and neither of us talked much about Cascadia. There was nothing to say that Marcus hadn't already said. We were waiting, and waiting for federal investigations to develop is the kind of activity that either drives you insane or teaches you patience. I'd learned patience a long time ago. On the third day, I got a call from Priya Nakamura, who ran the compliance analyst team that had reported to me. She was calling from her personal cell phone, standing in a parking lot somewhere, and her voice had the tight, controlled quality of someone who wasn't sure whether she was allowed to be making the call. "Grayson, I know I shouldn't be calling you, but something is happening here and I thought you should know. Ronan called an emergency compliance meeting yesterday afternoon. He told us that you had been terminated for filing an unauthorized report that violated internal escalation procedures. He said the report was going to be recalled, and that we needed to prepare a corrective filing explaining that the original submission had been made in error." I closed my eyes and took a slow breath. "Priya, listen to me carefully. Do not participate in any effort to submit a corrective filing. Do not sign anything, do not draft anything, do not put your name on any document related to that SAR. Federal reports cannot be recalled. Any attempt to characterize the original filing as an error would itself constitute a federal crime, and anyone whose name is on that corrective filing would be personally exposed. Do you understand what I'm telling you?" "I think so." "Grayson, what should I do?" "You should document in your own personal notes kept on your personal devices exactly what Ronan said in that meeting yesterday. The date, the time, the attendees, the specific statements. Don't send it to anyone. Don't share it with anyone at the bank. Just preserve it. And Priya, if he asks you to sign anything, refuse. Cite your obligations under the Bank Secrecy Act. He will not fire you for that, because firing a second compliance officer within a week of the first one would be professional suicide for him at this point." She thanked me and hung up. I called Marcus immediately and relayed the conversation. He was quiet for a long moment. "Grayson, this is escalating faster than I expected. Ronan is now attempting to obstruct a federal investigation by suborning other employees into submitting false regulatory filings. That's not a compliance issue anymore. That's a criminal issue. I'm going to reach out to a contact of mine at the Bureau's white-collar division in the field office nearest to you. I think they need to know that Ronan is actively trying to bury this before they've even had a chance to open a case." He made the call within the hour. I don't know exactly what was said, and Marcus was careful to tell me only what I needed to know, because the last thing either of us wanted was for me to become a witness whose testimony had been contaminated by learning too much too early. What I did learn, 3 days later, was that a case had been opened. 2 special agents had been assigned. A subpoena for records had been prepared. And someone at the Bureau, someone with authority over how the case would be executed, had made a decision about how much time they were willing to give Ronan Blackwell to make things worse. 11 days after my termination at 9:14 on a Wednesday morning, 3 unmarked federal vehicles pulled up to the front of Cascadia Private Bank's downtown headquarters. I know the exact time because Priya Nakamura sent me a text message from her personal phone that read only, "They're here." 6 special agents entered the building, presented a search warrant to the reception desk, and asked to be escorted to the executive floor. 2 more agents entered through the loading dock at the rear of the building to prevent anyone from leaving through the service entrance. Within 20 minutes, the entire executive floor was under federal seizure. I learned most of what happened that morning from the local business press over the following days, and later from Marcus, who had contacts inside the investigation. The agents seized Ronan Blackwell's computer, his phone, the contents of his desk drawers, and the entire contents of the private wealth management server. They also seized the personnel file that Ronan had created for me, including the backdated documentation he'd fabricated to support the restructuring narrative. Federal forensic examiners can determine when a document was actually created regardless of what date is typed at the top of it. Ronan had apparently never learned this, or had learned it and assumed no one would look closely enough to notice. The investigation moved quickly after that morning. Within 72 hours, subpoenas had been issued to 7 additional entities connected to Meridian Holdings Group. 2 of them were shell companies registered in Nevada. One was a construction firm in New Jersey that had already been under federal scrutiny for months, and one, buried 3 layers deep in the ownership chain, was a Delaware LLC whose sole beneficial owner was listed as Catriona Blackwell. That name meant nothing to most of the people reading the eventual indictment. It meant something very specific to me. Catriona Blackwell was Ronan's wife. The scheme, as it eventually emerged in public court filings, was almost elegant in its structure. Alastair Cheng Vanderberg had been laundering money for a network of overseas investors for the better part of 3 years, using his legitimate real estate developments as cover for the movement of funds that had originated in jurisdictions Cascadia would never have knowingly done business with. Ronan had been onboarding these transactions, personally overriding compliance flags, in exchange for what the indictment described as a series of transfers routed through his wife's LLC. Those transfers were structured to appear as consulting fees. The total amount that had moved through Catriona Blackwell's entity over the previous 14 months exceeded $2.3 million. Ronan was arrested at his home on a Friday morning. His wife was arrested the same day. Alastair Cheng Vanderberg was arrested at his office in the presence of 3 of his employees, who watched him being led out in handcuffs while the agents carried bankers' boxes of documents past their desks. The bank itself was not indicted, though the consent order that eventually came down from the federal regulators imposed a $54 million penalty and required the appointment of an independent monitor for a period of 5 years. Cascadia's stock dropped 18% in the 2 weeks following the arrests and did not recover for nearly a year. I was not called as a witness during the initial phase of the investigation. Marcus had negotiated an arrangement with the U.S. Attorney's Office in which I would provide sworn testimony only if the case went to trial. Ronan pled guilty within 6 months to conspiracy to commit money laundering, obstruction of a federal investigation, and violation of the Bank Secrecy Act. He was sentenced to 11 years in federal prison. His wife received 4 years. Alastair Cheng Vanderberg received 17 years and forfeited assets valued at approximately $81 million. The Whistleblower Award came in a manila envelope from the Treasury Department, delivered by certified mail on a Tuesday morning in the middle of the following spring. I was sitting at the kitchen table when Alina brought it in, and I remember she set it down in front of me without saying anything, because she'd seen the return address and understood what it probably was. I opened it slowly. The letter inside was 2 pages long, written in the careful formal language that federal agencies use when they are conveying decisions of significant financial consequence. The award, calculated as a percentage of the total penalties collected and assets forfeited in connection with the case, was substantially larger than anything I had allowed myself to expect. I'm not going to give the exact figure here, because Marcus advised me from the beginning that discussing specific award amounts in public creates complications I don't need. What I will say is that the award, combined with the settlement Marcus eventually negotiated on my wrongful termination claim against Cascadia, was enough to change the arithmetic of the rest of my life. Alina and I sat at that kitchen table for a long time that morning, reading the letter twice, and neither of us said very much. When you have worked for 26 years in a field where the highest professional aspiration is to remain invisible and unblemished, sudden financial vindication does not feel like a lottery win. It feels like the ledger finally balancing after years of quiet effort. The settlement with Cascadia came together faster than I had expected. The bank's litigation counsel, once they'd reviewed the file, understood immediately that a jury trial would be catastrophic. The evidence of retaliation was overwhelming. The timeline was documented down to the minute. Delphine Ashworth, the HR representative who had sat in on my termination meeting, had already been interviewed by federal investigators and had reportedly cooperated fully, including testifying about the backdated documentation Ronan had asked her to prepare. Cascadia settled the wrongful termination claim in mediation over the course of 2 afternoons. The terms were confidential. I will only say that they were sufficient. But the money, honestly, was not the part of any of this that mattered most to me. What mattered was what happened over the following months, as the story of the Cascadia case moved through the compliance industry, and I began receiving calls from people I had never met. Compliance officers from banks all over the country reached out to ask for advice about situations they were navigating. Some of them were dealing with directors who were pressuring them to look the other way on questionable transactions. Some were being retaliated against for filings they had already made. Some were simply looking for reassurance that doing their jobs correctly was worth the professional risk. I took every one of those calls. I did not charge for the consultations, though several people offered. Marcus and I eventually formalized the arrangement by establishing a small consulting practice, which we called Whitaker Compliance Advisory. The practice offered 2 services. The first was independent BSA and anti-money laundering consulting for community banks and credit unions that were too small to justify a full-time senior compliance officer, but too regulated to operate without one. The second was what Marcus and I described privately as whistleblower preparation, a service designed for compliance officers who suspected they were about to be forced into a moral confrontation with their employers and wanted to make sure they understood their legal protections before the confrontation happened. The whistleblower preparation work was quiet, almost entirely word of mouth, and it turned out to be the most meaningful work I had ever done. The first client of the whistleblower preparation practice came to us through a compliance officer I had briefly worked with years earlier at a conference. Her name was Imani Ferreira, and she was the BSA officer at a regional bank in the Southeast that had recently been acquired by a larger holding company. The acquiring company had brought in new executive leadership, and within 3 months of the transition, Imani had begun noticing patterns in the private banking portfolio that reminded her uncomfortably of a case she had read about in the trade press. That case, of course, was mine. She had called me not because she wanted to file anything yet, but because she wanted to understand what filing would cost her, personally and professionally, before she took the step. We spent 4 hours on the phone that first day. I walked her through everything I had learned, the importance of filing before conversations with executives rather than after, the value of contemporaneous notes preserved on personal devices, the protections available under federal whistleblower statutes, and the specific procedural steps required to invoke them properly. The critical importance of retaining independent counsel before any confrontation with management. And most importantly, the mental preparation required to accept that doing the right thing in this profession sometimes means walking out of a building for the last time on a night you did not plan for. Imani filed her SAR 11 days after our conversation. Her termination came within 6 hours. Her federal case settled 18 months later. Over the following 3 years, I worked with 14 compliance officers in similar situations. Not all of them ended up filing. Some of them, after working through the analysis together, determined that their situations did not actually rise to the level of federal reporting obligations, and they were able to remain in their positions and address the concerns through internal channels. Others, like Imani, discovered that the situations they were describing were actually the visible surface of much larger problems, and their filings ended up triggering investigations of significant scope. In every case, my role was the same. I did not tell them what to do. I told them what they were legally required to do, what protections were available to them if they chose to act, and what mistakes to avoid along the way. Priya Nakamura, my former analyst at Cascadia, eventually took over the day-to-day operation of the community bank consulting side of the practice. She had left Cascadia 6 months after the arrests, having concluded correctly that her career there was permanently compromised by her association with the case, and had spent a year working at a competitor before joining us. She was an excellent BSA officer, and she was building into an even better senior consultant. Marcus and I gave her equity in the practice within her first year. Watching her develop into the kind of professional who would eventually mentor other analysts the way I had once mentored her was one of the deep, unexpected pleasures of the second half of my career. Ronan Blackwell served his federal sentence at a low-security facility in Pennsylvania. I never saw him again after the night he terminated me, and I have never had any interest in seeing him. His wife Catriona was released after serving 31 months. Their marriage did not survive the incarceration. Alastair Cheng Vanderberg remains in federal custody as of this recording. The $81 million in forfeited assets was eventually distributed through a combination of restitution to identified victims, penalties returned to the General Treasury, and awards to whistleblowers and cooperating witnesses. The Cascadia Private Bank Consent Order concluded its 5-year term last summer. The bank still exists, though it operates under a different corporate name after being acquired by a larger institution. I want to close this story with something I've come to understand more clearly over the years since that Tuesday evening in Ronan's office, because I think it's the part that matters most for anyone who might one day find themselves in a similar situation. What Ronan Blackwell fundamentally misunderstood, and what a certain kind of executive continues to misunderstand across every regulated industry in this country, is the nature of the person sitting across from him in that meeting. He believed he was firing an employee. He was actually firing an officer of a federal regulatory framework who happened to be paid by his bank. Those are two very different things, and the difference is written into decades of federal law that Ronan had apparently never bothered to read carefully. When you take a job as a Bank Secrecy Act officer, you take on obligations that do not disappear when your employer decides they've become inconvenient. The reports you file are not internal documents subject to executive discretion. They are federal filings that create permanent records in federal databases. The safe harbor provisions that protect BSA officers from retaliation are not corporate policies that can be revised in the next employee handbook. They are statutory rights enforced by federal courts with the full weight of the United States government behind them. Ronan believed he could fire that authority out of his building. He discovered instead that he could only fire the person carrying it, and that the authority itself would continue to operate through federal investigators long after that person had cleaned out his desk. The larger lesson, the one I try to communicate to every young compliance officer who calls the practice these days, is this: the people who will eventually try to compromise your work will almost never announce themselves as villains. They will present themselves as reasonable executives asking reasonable questions about your judgment, your escalation practices, your understanding of the broader business context. They will invite you into meetings that feel collaborative and use language that sounds professional. And somewhere in the middle of one of those conversations, they will ask you to do something or refrain from doing something that would violate the federal obligations you took on when you accepted your license. In that moment, you have to be prepared to say no clearly, calmly, and without apology, not because you enjoy conflict, because saying no is what you were hired to be able to do. I turned 58 last month. I've been out of Cascadia for 6 years now. Alina and I bought a small property outside the city where I keep a workshop for restoring old furniture on weekends, which is the closest thing to a hobby I've allowed myself in 3 decades. The practice continues to grow. Priya took over as managing partner last year. Marcus retired from active litigation, but still consults on our more complex whistleblower matters. We've added 2 junior consultants and are training a 3rd. The work is good, the clients are serious, and the mission remains what it has always been: Help the people whose job it is to see clearly, see clearly. Help the people whose job it is to say no. Learn to say it in a way that will hold up in court. If you're watching this and any part of it feels familiar to your own professional situation, please subscribe to the channel for more stories like this one. Leave a comment sharing your own experience if you're comfortable doing so. Share this video with any colleague who works in compliance, audit, risk, or any of the other quiet professions that hold institutions accountable when nobody else is looking. And remember, when you file the report, file it before the meeting. The meeting is not the process. The meeting is what happens after the process is already finished.